So that brings us to the third model, which is the American disease model. Once prohibition was repealed, it was important to now have a new understanding of what alcoholism was and what was causing it. And it was decided that there was something different about the minority of people, those people who had alcohol problems. They didn't know what it was at the time, but obviously the majority of citizens could drink just fine. But there was always that group that just couldn't. So they came up with the idea of a disease of some sort. And let me show you some of its factors. So first of all, their basic description was the X factor plus alcohol equals alcoholism. And it's that X factor that was the thing that was different in those people, although they didn't really know exactly what it was. So when I first went to treatment in 1975, I was 23, and that is still a definition that was given then and now. But it's not horribly accurate, and I think we're getting closer to the real understanding and cause of alcoholism. But let's look at what some of the characteristics were about the American disease model. First of all, they like to compare it to an allergy of some sort to alcohol. And, you know, as an alcoholic, I get that. I understand that. It's not the best description in the world, but the way it acts and feels and everything isn't unlike a pretty horrible allergy. So under this model, it was believed that there were physical, psychological, and spiritual causes. Now that comes from the development of Alcoholics Anonymous. Following the repeal of Prohibition, AA came into being and slowly grew. And of course, they ended up writing and revising these days something they called the Big Book. And this was the perspective then that came from Alcoholics Anonymous, that alcohol problems are physical in nature, they're psychological and emotional in nature, and it also has accompanied by spiritual issues and problems. The other characteristic is loss of control. So in Alcoholics Anonymous, they say 1 drink is too many and 1,000 not enough. And that's what they mean by loss of control. You know, loss of control isn't something that happens every single time you drink. What it means today is that you are unable to consistently predict how much alcohol you'll consume and what your behavior is going to be like. Alcoholics can do little periods of moderation just like anybody else, and they can stay away from alcohol and whatever else. And believe me, the test for alcoholism is not to ask people to stay sober for 30 days, because a lot of people can do that. The real test is, can you control it? So when I ask somebody, you know, who's not willing to see their addiction at that point, what I would do is sit down and work out with them their view of what social drinking is. And, you know, commonly it's like 3 times a week, 3 drinks maximum at any one setting. And that's the contract that you draw up. Now, just because there's a wedding or a funeral or your birthday doesn't make a difference. This is it. You know, I have a sister who's a social drinker. She doesn't have any trouble. It doesn't matter what the event is. She might have a drink. But she doesn't, you know, consider getting drunk. The third thing is the inability to stop once it's started. and that kind of gets back to this allergy thing that, there's kind of an agitation there that pushes you to continue drinking. And again, it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean it happens every single time. But it happens often. And the last thing is that, under this model, is that alcoholism is progressive. Now, what they originally meant by this is that even if you stopped drinking, the disease itself would continue to progress. So, like, if you stayed sober for 20 years and started drinking again, it would be as if you were drinking that entire time. Well, you can probably see the problem with that. I mean, you'd have to be careful putting aftershave on, for God's sakes. You'd fall into a coma or have a seizure or something. And unfortunately, you'll still hear that in certain treatment centers. And the fact is, it's not progressive in that fashion. But, left untreated, yes, things do tend to get worse over time. Believe me, I've seen plenty of people whose drinking just kind of dropped off and they weren't that interested in it anymore. I have no idea why they're different from alcoholics. We would certainly have diagnosed them at one time, but in general it means that, you'll go through periods of moderating or stopping or something, but that if you continue to drink, it's just going to go downhill. And I'd have to agree with that. So, let me go back one here. So out of the American disease perspective, we get things like 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and I can't remember how many 12-step groups there are, but there's a 12-step group for everything, right? So, as we discussed, the causes are thought to be some kind of constitution, meaning your particular makeup ends up not being able to handle alcohol, which, again, is an abnormality of some sort. And the irreversible part means you're not going to go back to social drinking. That's not 100% correct, but it's way too right to risk it. So interventions, the kind of interventions we would do under this model is, first of all, identify it and confront people with what it is. And it's not meant to be a very negative thing and hostile and angry and that sort of thing. But, it's putting reality in front of another person, and in the hopes that they'll see that there's something wrong. People talk about denial of alcoholism. From an alcoholic's point of view, it's just normal. You don't deny what's normal, but it's the inability to see the irrational thinking and the irrational behavior. Your mind really changes as a practicing addict, and it changes again once you're clean and sober. Another intervention, of course, is lifelong abstinence. That's the best advice and prescription that we have today. Yes, as I said, some people might go back to moderation, some people might quit on their own, but we really don't have an intervention that we know of that will predictably and consistently allow you to drink in moderation. I'll eventually tell you about this one man who has invented, supposedly, artificial alcohol and an artificial, I don't want to say cure, but his example was, he got himself drunk on this stuff. He took a that particular medication that he's devising, suddenly he's just 100% sober again. But, yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of things that come up. So who are the intervention agents? Well, other recovering alcoholics, support of people like yourself. A lot of people criticize Alcoholics Anonymous because there's no professional involved, and it's possible that people are going to give you some really bad advice, like don't use your antidepressants and stuff like that. And believe me, that's happened. But what people don't get sometimes about AA is that the real power is the fact that you're with people just like yourself. You don't have to explain things. And in AA and NA and programs like that, they laugh about things that would curl your hair, but they know immediately, what one another is talking about. If somebody shares about shadow people, all the meth addicts break up because they know. And, you don't feel so crazy or out of place when you've got people thinking that too. The last criticism of AA that I don't particularly like or agree with is that it absolves people of all responsibility. Well, it sort of. It no longer looks at alcoholism as a personal choice. Your choice pretty much started as a kid when you decided to drink or smoke pot or whatever else it happens to be. Yeah, that was a choice, but let's be honest here. The majority of kids make that choice. They don't all become addicts or anything else like that. But if you attend any meeting or if you go visit any treatment center, you're going to find that it's far from that, that you're absolved of responsibility. To the contrary, you are held responsible for everything that you do. Now, yeah, that it doesn't mean that you cause that disease. It's possible because there's something different. You personally have nothing to do with that. But don't think people are getting off the hook. That's not at all the situation. All of you will go visit a 12-step meeting in the future, and you'll see what I mean. Okay?